Well, welcome to the Robotics Through Science Fiction podcast. I'm Robin Murphy, and today we have Jeremy Brent, who's going to talk to us about curating science fiction. He's an associate professor curator of the science fiction and fantasy collection at Texas A&M. Jeremy, thank you for being here.
No, thanks for having me. No, this is great. This is a lot of fun.
Well, super. Well, what does an associate professor curator of science fiction and fantasy do in their science fiction and fantasy collections at Texas A&M?
Yeah, so the collection we actually do, a lot of people are surprised to know that. We actually have one of the largest science fiction fantasy research collections in the world, as opposed to like a private collection. I'm sure there are rich people out there who have giant collections of their own. But we are one of the largest collections assembled in an institution for research. So there's thousands and thousands of the books and pulp magazines and scholarly journals and archival collections, objects and art and comic books and all kinds of out of the way crazy things. So to be the curator of the collection, to be a collection curator is kind of like to be the overlord of a collection, right? I'm in charge of almost every aspect of a collection. So I develop the collection, so I find materials to add to it, whether it's through donations. So I talk to donors, I solicit donations, I buy materials. We have specific budgets for collections, so I'm in charge of selecting and buying things. For archival collections, I'm in charge of processing those. So that's the fancy way of saying, taking stuff that's in a box and like refolding it, reboxing it, making it usable for people. I'm in charge of doing exhibits and other sort of outreach events to publicize the collection. So I basically do everything for the collection, except I don't do the actual cataloging. We have specialized people who do that kind of stuff. Other than that, yeah, it's kind of my own little empire that I am in charge of.
Wow. I mean, so that's like, so you get to basically care and feed all the science fictions and fantasy stuff.
Yeah.
So that's just amazing. Why? So let's circle back to this idea of research. What is research in science fiction and fantasy stuff?
Well, I mean, especially in the last, 2020? I guess maybe especially in the last 30 or 40 years, science fiction and fantasy have both come to be seen increasingly as objects of legitimate study. Right, they're not just like, oh, crazy stuff the kids like, and it's all Star Wars and Star Trek, and it's fun, but it's not quote unquote real, right? But there's this long historical tradition of science fiction, a couple hundred years old, and there's a lot of important authors and other creators who have created these stories and created these worlds that are important, are culturally important, and they're important from a literary standpoint and cinematic standpoint. And so, like any other kind of literature, science fiction, fantasy need to be studied. They deserve to be studied by scholars and amateur researchers alike. To study it, you need to have study material. So you need the primary sources that go into creating that genre. So the books, the correspondence and manuscripts of authors, all the stuff you would think of for any other historical subject is equally valid for science fiction and fantasy. So that's why we have this collection here.
Okay, so you've got things like just not only the books, but you might have things like the other libraries have Ernest Hemingway's letters writing about what motivated him to write The Old Man and the Sea, and you have those for like Isaac Asimov or?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
Right, science fiction authors use that kind of stuff too. We do have stuff from Isaac Asimov. Asimov is those early science fiction writers, those golden age and pulp era writers are a little hard to track down because unlike modern writers that tend to take their materials and all give it to one place, those older generations kind of often have their stuff scattered. So, for example, there's a Center for Ray Bradbury Studies in Indiana where they have a lot of the stuff, but a lot of Ray Bradbury's papers and stuff are all over the place. I mean, we've got a little bit of it ourselves. For Asimov, we've got a couple boxes of correspondence. Most of it is correspondence like with his agent, his publisher. So it's less about, in Asimov's case, the stuff we have is less about the actual creation of his work and more about the publishing aspect and the aspect of getting that stuff out to the world. So, which is also important if you're going to understand Asimov or anybody in science fiction. who writes, you need to understand it from start to finish. So you need to understand their lives from birth through their literary development, through the stuff they put down on paper, and how that actually gets published and put out in the world.
So I really liked Alec Neville-Lee's book, Astounding, going through that. And so is that the kind of research to go back through and see what Campbell was actually putting down in writing to the people and which ones he was rejecting and how they're like snarking among themselves about that?
Oh, definitely. And Alec's book is great, especially because Alec is not shy about saying how I found all these great archives that I think Campbell stuff is at Harvard or MIT. I should know this. But yeah, he found this huge treasure trove of papers that hadn't really been examined yet. And from that, he managed to weave this really incredible story about Campbell, his relationship to Asimov and Heinlein and Hubbard. And it's really interesting. And that's kind of the gold, something like the kind of book Alec has written is kind of like a gold standard for archives. Like, oh my God, some really good writer came in, made use of materials that we've been holding, and from that pulled out really interesting and important cultural and historical stories. So, I mean, the kind of stuff Alec does, that's like, oh, that's why we're here, to make that stuff happen.
Well, that's so cool. Well, I guess I could see like MIT having a big collection, but Texas A&M, how in the heck did Texas A&M end up with one of the largest collections?
We get asked that a lot. It's a good question. So back in the 70s, we had a librarian working for the library named Hal Hall, and Hal is still alive. He's retired, but he's still in the game. Was a serious librarian, and Hal, as well as being a librarian, is also a scholar and a bibliographer of science fiction. He's written one of the standard bibliographies for science fiction. And he was going through a bunch of magazines one day, and he found the back of the science fiction. I can't remember what magazine. I should ask him what magazine it was. He found an advertisement that was selling cheaply, like 200 science fiction paperbacks or something like that. And Hal decided this was the chance. Like, hey, Hal got the idea. We could build a collection out of this. So he went to our director of the library at the time, and he made his case. He said, look, he said basically the kind of thing I've just been telling you. Like, science fiction is a legitimate form of study. This is our chance to build a collection around it. There aren't that many collections in the world that collect this stuff systematically, and there still are not. This is our chance to really make our mark. Plus, and he likes to throw in A&M, engineering school, right? And like a lot of the engineering profession got their start because they were interested in science fiction. Partially because, as Hal also likes to point out, engineers love science fiction because they're the heroes, right? Like you can't have Star Trek without Scotty saving the day every week, for example, right? So with all this, he convinced the director to the library that this would be a good idea. He went to the English department also, and the English department kind of poo-pooed it. Like they were still at the time more of the like science fiction. That's not like real literature. Although the English department now at A&M is huge into science fiction. It's a concentration science fiction here. It's about to be a minor. So they've come a long way themselves, but that's kind of where the collection started. Little seed of about 200 paperbacks or so, and over the next subsequent 40 years, this is how it's grown.
Wow. Well, when I think of the golden age of science fiction, I think of the attic above my grandparents' house, which was full of all of my dad's books from when World War II. You know, he'd just read everything from Astounding and Galaxy and all that. Also, you know, a lot of silverfish and moldy stuff. I mean, how do y'all deal with that? I mean, are they in boxes, I guess not in an attic, in the basement somewhere? Or are they in a special vault or on the shelves?
We're a special collections library here, Cushing, and we don't have open shelves. So it's not the public library or university library. You just walk the shelf, pull a book off the shelf, and leave. Our stuff, 99% of everything in this building, you are free to look at and research and deal with and sit with and work with, but you can't actually leave the building. What we do with our materials, we keep them in closed stacks. They are in climate-controlled stacked areas that run about 65 degrees. And we try to keep the humidity around the 30 to 40%. That's kind of the ideal condition to keep paper from completely falling apart. So stuff is maintained on metal shelves. Wood shelves outgas, so metal shelves are more chemically stable. We keep them on metal shelves. They're kept behind closed doors. You need a special ID to access them. You can't just walk in climate control conditions. So that keeps entropy at bay as best we can. It's not perfect. I mean, obviously, eventually everything is going to be destroyed, but this kind of the kind of conditions we keep safe under extends their life by hundreds and hundreds of years. So.
And that the idea that some of these stories, you know, are good for hundreds and hundreds of years when they were just trying to get out. I think like Philip K. Dick was always just living from paycheck to paycheck. So, you know, that's got to be, I guess, a lot of great authors are looking down, going, "Wow, I never thought of that."
Yeah, also a lot of terrible authors are also like, "Wow, really?" And you're going to tell a whole story of science fiction. It can't just be like Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury. You want the wide range, and that includes a lot of science fiction that isn't that great, but that's part of the story too. And you know, every book and every story have their readers. There's always someone out there that book or that story, no matter how subjectively or objectively terrible we might think it is, people like it. And so people liked it at the time, and you know, things come around again. And I mean, we keep this stuff partially because someone may find that book that it was forgotten about, or whether for justly or unjustly, and it'll get picked up again. That's another reason to have a collection like this, so every story can find a reader at some point in the future, if not now.
So they're all kept in nice shelves in that, as opposed to your office, which seems like would be a perfect place to keep it unseen. Everything. Tell us about your office, because there's lots of cool stuff back there. Any robots back there on your wall? Any robots on your walls?
Any robots on my walls? I do have a couple robots. I have a couple robots. I have my little Tom Servo. They keep on my gosh. And I have my my L337 from Solo, which is kind of fun.
One of the best robots of all time.
Right? I love them, her, however you're going to define it. Yeah, I actually looking around. I need more robots in general. But there's a lot of science fiction-y stuff in my office. A lot of it's superhero oriented. It's good for visual flair. Yeah, I just try to keep things that interest me. I work in this office like 8 hours a day, and you know, so I want to reflect my interests and my mind. So I'm not just looking at a blank wall. So yeah, so I mean, it's full of action figures and posters and all kinds of stuff. Now, not everything in here is science fiction, but like probably 90% of it is. So.
Well, it's great to look at. You know, I like to zoom in on all of that and see all of your different acquisitions. And I know you've had a lot of authors sign things for you as well. And you know, I'm sure Murderbot's in there somewhere from Martha Wells.
Yeah.
Because she's a homie, a local from used to work at Texas A&M.
Yes, and she lives about half a mile from me. So yeah, Murderbot is definitely these days among my favorite robots. I know, expanding the concept of robot, right? Because Murderbot's sort of a cyborgish, androidy conception, but still, yeah, no. Anyone out there who has not read Murderbot, Martha Wells' books, go read them now because they're the best.
Oh, I made somebody who because of my recommendation started reading. I said, no, you must start at the very beginning.
Oh yeah.
You need to run them in there, because starting it with art, you know, and network effect, you just to get the fun of it.
Yeah.
You know, even more so. And art's one of my favorite spaceships of all time. Yeah, just wonderful. Well, all right, let's get back to this idea of the special collection stuff. And that, so John Grisham's book a couple of ones back was Camino Winds, where thieves broke in to Princeton's library and they got F. Scott Fitzgerald's papers, and then they were able to put it on the black market. So what, from the science fiction and fantasy collection, do you think thieves would go for if this were a John Grisham novel?
That's a good question. Okay, I am not recommending or recommending that people steal things. So.
Oh, no. That wasn't the point of the question. It was kind of
for legal purposes. I don't endorse stealing. I guess if I were thinking as a thief, you want to go for value. We have a lot of materials from a book standpoint. We have a growing collection of what we call kind of proto science fiction. That's kind of a general term. Most critics, and I tend to agree, kind of think that if you're talking about when science fiction as we know it starts, we kind of think it starts basically with Frankenstein in 1818.
Yeah.
And everything before that is what we call proto science fiction. So it's like it's not quite science fiction as we understand it. It's like getting there. So we've got a growing number of that stuff from the 17th and 18th centuries, which are certainly valuable and relatively rare. So those are collections, those are things we're particularly proud of. It's hard to find those anywhere. And they're really beautiful works. So, I mean, if you're going to steal things, you might as well steal things like that. I mean, a lot of the materials that we have are important, but they're not necessarily rare. Like, for instance, we have first editions of, go back to Asimov, we have like first editions of iRobot and things like that. But while important and really exciting, interesting, they're not necessarily rare per se. There's a reasonable number of them out there because they printed them in so many copies. So yeah, so it's really, I guess it depends what kind of a thief you are. I mean,
which again, we're not condoning thievery. It was just a little thought experiment to try to elucidate what was really valuable in the collection.
These and special collections are also notorious for in general, special collections in general, for trying to steal things signed or written by important people. There was a scandal just a few years ago. This guy who got caught by a bookseller, because book dealers are always on the lookout for these kind of thieves, who had been going around apparently different special collections, not us, but different institutions, and he'd been like cutting out signatures. Like he cut out signatures of like, oh, a letter from George Washington, and cut out the signature, or from Abraham Lincoln or whatever, and you sell the signatures because you can sell those easier, than it's less suspicious, and like selling, hey, an entire letter, and easier to smuggle out. So that's the kind of thing that if you're a particularly nefarious thief, you'll not only steal something, but you'll destroy it and sell it in bits. So that's if you're that kind of awful person, you could steal. We have archival stuff written and signed by authors, which is the kind of thing you might try to get away with, but I wouldn't advise it. I mean, we have security here, so.
And that's awful. That's just such a sacrilege to tear that up.
And then like our map collection, my colleague is our map librarian. She has a lot of atlases, like old style atlases, and it's hard to find sometimes atlases or old books with maps in them. Sometimes the maps have been scissored out because thieves will want to sell the maps separately. So you end up with a number of books that are beautiful books, and they came with beautiful maps at one time, but the maps are gone.
Oh, that's a shame. So as a roboticist, what you got for Isaac Asimov, and what do you think? Because this would have been his 100th birthday.
Mm-hmm. So we have, and I'm annoyed, by the way, because COVID kind of put the brakes on the little pop-up exhibit we were going to celebrate at Asimov. We were going to be able to publicize that more, but COVID. So we have, in addition to the small amount of primary documentation, the correspondence I talked about, we've got first editions of most of his works, most of his important science fiction works. Not most his works, of course. Asimov was like crazy prolific, so have all his stuff would be nuts. We don't really have a lot of his nonfiction. There's a few copies here and there. But yeah, so first editions of most of his important work, different editions of a lot of his work, so American printings and British printings. We try to collect multiple printings and editions of different authors because the cover art is different. Sometimes there's different materials, like one version will have one map or a glossary and one won't. So we've got that. From Asimov's point, from the point of view of Asimov, what I think is most important we have all the pulp magazines where he appeared. The original pulps, and those are kind of fun because even if he doesn't get the cover art, you get to see where those stories. And a lot of us are used to reading like, well, I read the iRobot stories in like a book, or I read the Foundation stories like collected into a book, or which are fine. But it's kind of neat also to see the original 1940s, 50s pulp magazines they appeared in with their art and with in the context of the other stuff that was being written at the time. So that's a lot of fun. So.
Oh, that sounds really cool. Well, I'm so, yes, this whole COVID pandemic has just messed up a lot of things. Yeah. Well, we're out of time, but I got to ask you the most important question.
Oh yeah.
That is, what is your favorite fictional robot?
I was thinking about this question. I wish I had just one. I try to look at a sort of 4 or 5. I mean, Murderbot is up there. You can't not love Murderbot and all their emotional angst and frustration with humanity. One of the reasons I keep my little Tom Servo here is because I'm a huge fan of Tom and Crow for Mystery Science Theater, so I have my little Tom Servo. I like Tom better, I think, just because he's more pseudo-intellectual, which I kind of find refreshing about him. I'm a big fan of L337 from Solo. That's a great robot. Robots, but I was thinking about this when I have some sentimental attachment to robots I first encountered when I was a kid. So despite his complete ridiculousness as a robot, I love the robot from Lost in Space, just because like that was one of the first robots I ever encountered, and he's just I love that show when I was a kid, and so I would see him all the time, and that was a fun robot. I'm also a fan of when I was a kid I read the Oz books, so TikTok,
Yeah.
the Mechanical Man. He's always that's always a lot of fun. I'm trying to think. I've also lately, again, using robot expansively, I've been a fan of Doom Patrol lately, so I'm really getting into Cliff, the character. This is a character who was a race car driver, and he was in an accident. He had his brain removed and put inside a robot suit. So again, it's sort of like a cyborg robot hybrid creation. But the show Doom Patrol, Brendan Fraser does the voice. It's hilarious because he's ridiculously profane, but also very angsty about his past, the mistakes he made as a person. He's trying to make up for those. It's a really fun character. So I've got several robots that I'm into.
It sounds like it. Well, that's very, very cool. Well, maybe we can get you back and talk more, particularly about what all the things you would have shown about Asimov and other robot writers. There. So anyway, thank you. And for those of you who want to learn more about real robots, please check out my new book, Learn AI and Human-Robot Interaction Through Asimov's iRobot Stories.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's my older book, Robotics Through Science Fiction.
Which I should point out, if Robin hasn't, is the first book, we have a copy of that book here, is the first book ever delivered here by a robot. And if you go to our if you do our library catalog and check the catalog record, we have noted that it was the first book here delivered by a robot.
And hopefully it won't be the last book delivered by a robot. But yeah, that was a lot of fun to do that, particularly going past all of the swords from the Game of Thrones. And that's a whole nother conversation.
Oh, yeah.
But we need to wrap it up here. So hopefully everybody's enjoyed this podcast and that they'll remember to subscribe to our newsletter and to the podcast series on YouTube.